The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Clearwater, its rays illuminating the dust kicked up by hundreds of boots moving in formation. Staff Sergeant Isabella Morales stood quietly at the edge of the training area, her slight frame almost lost among the towering pine trees that bordered the base. She watched the newest batch of recruits stumble through their first formation, her dark eyes taking in every detail with a patience that seemed almost otherworldly. What none of these fresh-faced soldiers knew was that they were in the presence of someone who had already paid the ultimate price for freedom and lived to tell about it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Fort Clearwater had been Isabella's home for the past 18 months, though home felt like too strong a word for someone who had spent the better part of her military career moving from one classified assignment to another. Alpha Company. 3rd Battalion was supposed to be her quiet assignment, a place where she could blend into the background and do her job without the weight of expectations or the burden of her past following her around like a shadow. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who had once been the subject of presidential commendations and congressional hearings, now watching privates who couldn't even tie their boots correctly without looking down. But that was exactly how she wanted it. After what she had been through, after what she had seen and done, the simple routine of training basic soldiers felt like a gift. Private Connor Blake was impossible to miss in the crowd of new arrivals. At 6'2", with the kind of broad shoulders that came from years of high school football and college athletics, he moved with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer force of will. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots gleamed like mirrors, and his posture screamed of someone who expected to be noticed and respected. Blake had graduated from officer candidate school in the top 10% of his class, but a minor administrative issue had delayed his commission, landing him temporarily in the enlisted ranks. It was a situation that clearly frustrated him, and he made no effort to hide his belief that he was destined for bigger things than taking orders from what he saw as career NCOs who lacked his education and potential. "Look at this place, Blake," muttered to Private Nathan Cross, who had quickly become his closest ally among the new recruits. "Half these instructors look like they've never seen real action. That sergeant over there probably spent her whole career pushing papers in some supply depot." Cross followed Blake's gesture towards Staff Sergeant Morales, who was quietly observing their formation from her position near the tree line. Even from a distance, there was something about her that seemed ... different. She was smaller than most of the other NCOs, her movements more deliberate, her attention more focused. But to Blake, these qualities only reinforced his assumption that she was probably some kind of administrative specialist who had been given a training assignment to fill out her time until retirement. "She doesn't look like much," Cross agreed, eager to maintain his position in Blake's inner circle. "Probably got promoted through affirmative action rather than actual merit." Blake nodded, his assessment of Fort Clearwater's personnel continuing as he sized up the various instructors and senior enlisted personnel. In his mind, he was already categorizing them: the has-beens, the never-weres, and the few who might actually be worth learning from. Staff Sergeant Morales definitely fell into the second category. What Blake couldn't see from his position in formation was the way Master Sergeant Daniel Foster watched Staff Sergeant Morales with something approaching reverence. Foster had been at Fort Clearwater for 8 years, had seen hundreds of instructors come and go, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Isabella Morales. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she carried herself, that spoke of experiences far beyond the routine training cycles they conducted here. "New batch looks promising," Foster said quietly as he approached Morales's position. "Though that tall one in the front row might be trouble. He's got that look." Morales nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving the formation. Private Blake. I've read his file. Top of his OCS class, college athlete, comes from a military family. He's used to being the best at everything he does. And he's not going to take kindly to being told what to do by people he considers beneath him, Foster observed. No, Morales agreed, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement. He's not. The morning proceeded with the standard in-processing routine that every soldier had experienced at least once in their career. Equipment issue, medical checks, administrative briefings that seemed designed to test the limits of human patience. Through it all, Staff Sergeant Morales moved quietly through her assigned duties, checking off names on clipboards, ensuring that each new soldier received what they needed to begin their training. Blake noticed her throughout the day, though not in the way that Foster or the other senior NCOs did. To him, she was just another cog in the military bureaucracy, someone whose job was to facilitate his transition into what he assumed would be a brief stop on his way to greater things. He didn't notice the way she seemed to anticipate problems before they occurred, or how she managed to keep 30 confused privates organized and moving in the right direction with minimal effort. Sergeant Morales seems pretty quiet, Private Jessica Parker observed during their lunch break. Parker was one of the few recruits who had actually been paying attention during the morning's activities, and something about the staff sergeant had caught her notice. Quiet because she's got nothing interesting to say, Blake replied dismissively. Look at her, she's probably been doing the same job for the past 10 years. Some people just accept mediocrity, but Parker wasn't convinced. There was something about Staff Sergeant Morales that didn't quite fit Blake's assessment. The way she moved, the way she observed everything around her, with a kind of strategic awareness that seemed more suited to a combat zone than a training facility. And there were other details that didn't add up. The way Master Sergeant Foster deferred to her opinion on matters that seemed well outside her supposed area of expertise, or the way Captain Rebecca Hayes, the company commander, seemed to treat her less like a subordinate and more like a trusted advisor. As the afternoon wore on, Blake's confidence in his assessment of Fort Clearwater's personnel only grew. This was clearly going to be an easy assignment, a chance to excel among people who had settled for comfortable mediocrity. Staff Sergeant Morales, with her quiet demeanor and unassuming presence, epitomized everything he believed was wrong with the military's promotion system. What Blake didn't know, what none of the new recruits knew, was that Staff Sergeant Isabella Morales had specifically requested this assignment after spending 3 years in Walter Reed Medical Center recovering from injuries that would have ended most people's careers. She had chosen Fort Clearwater not because it was easy, but because it was far enough from Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon that she could disappear into the routine of training soldiers without constantly being reminded of the weight of her past. The scars that Blake would eventually notice weren't from training accidents or routine deployments. They were from the day she had single-handedly held off an entire Taliban unit while evacuating wounded civilians from a bombed-out school in Afghanistan. The quiet confidence that he mistook for weakness was actually the calm that came from having faced the worst that combat could offer and finding the strength to not just survive, but to save others. As the sun set over Fort Clearwater on that first day, Blake settled into his barracks with the satisfaction of someone who had quickly figured out his new environment. He had identified the key players, assessed the challenges, and positioned himself for success. In his mind, Staff Sergeant Morales was already filed away as someone who would present no obstacles to his advancement, but across the base, in the small apartment she had been assigned as senior enlisted quarters, Isabella Morales sat quietly at her kitchen table, reviewing the files of her new trainees. She had learned long ago that every soldier had a story, and understanding those stories was the key to helping them become the best versions of themselves. Private Connor Blake's file told the story of someone who had never truly been tested, who had succeeded through natural ability and determination, but had never faced the kind of challenges that revealed true character. She had seen dozens of soldiers like him over the years, talented, confident, and completely unprepared for the reality of what military service actually meant. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of helping him understand that real strength wasn't about being the biggest or loudest person in the room. It was about finding the courage to serve something greater than yourself, especially when no one was watching. The question was whether Private Blake would be willing to learn that lesson before his arrogance created problems. That could affect not just him, but the soldiers who would depend on him in the future. Staff Sergeant Morales had all the time in the world to find out. The 0500 wake-up call at Fort Clearwater came like a thunderclap, reverberating through the barracks and jolting 32 new recruits from whatever dreams they had managed to cobble together on their first night. Private Connor Blake was already awake, having conditioned himself during OCS to rise before reveille. He took pride in being ready before others even opened their eyes, seeing it as yet another advantage in what he viewed as a competition with everyone around him. As he laced up his boots with military precision, Blake observed his fellow recruits stumbling through their morning routines with the kind of detached amusement he might have shown watching children play dress-up. These weren't his peers, he reminded himself. They were temporary companions on a journey that would quickly separate the leaders from the followers. Move it, move it, move it. Master Sergeant Foster's voice echoed through the barracks, though. Blake noticed it lacked the theatrical intensity he had expected from military training. This wasn't the screaming, intimidating drill sergeant stereotype from movies. Foster was professional, direct, but not unnecessarily harsh. To Blake, this seemed like another sign that Fort Clearwater was a softer assignment than he had anticipated. The morning formation took place in the same spot where they had gathered the previous day, but now the new recruits were expected to demonstrate some semblance of military bearing. Staff Sergeant Morales stood at her usual position, clipboard in hand, observing the chaos with the same patient attention she had shown 24 hours earlier. Blake positioned himself in the front row, his posture perfect, his uniform immaculate. He had learned during his athletic career that first impressions mattered, and he intended to establish himself as the standard by which others would be measured. As his eyes swept the formation, he noticed several of his fellow privates struggling with basic positioning, their movements awkward and uncertain. Some of these people have no business being here, he muttered under his breath to Cross, who had managed to secure a spot next to him. Look at Rodriguez over there. He can't even stand at attention without swaying. Cross nodded eagerly, desperate to maintain his position as Blake's preferred audience. And that Parker girl keeps looking around like she's lost. How did she even make it through basic training? What Blake didn't notice was how Staff Sergeant Morales' eyes tracked every movement, every adjustment, every small success and failure within the formation. She wasn't just taking attendance or going through the motions of military routine. She was conducting an assessment that went far deeper than uniform appearance or ability to stand still. The morning's training began with physical fitness testing, push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run that would establish baseline measurements for each recruit's conditioning program. Blake approached the testing with the confidence of someone who had been a Division II linebacker, whose body had been honed through years of competitive athletics. Staff Sergeant Morales moved through the testing stations with quiet efficiency, recording scores, offering encouragement to struggling recruits, and maintaining the kind of steady presence that kept 32 nervous privates focused on their tasks rather than their anxieties. Blake noticed her throughout the morning, but only in the way one might notice a piece of equipment, present, functional, but not particularly noteworthy. Sergeant Morales, you're up for demonstration, Master Sergeant Foster announced as they reached the push-up station. Show them proper form. Blake watched with casual interest as the staff sergeant dropped into position. She was small, probably. No more than 5'4", and her frame seemed almost delicate compared to the broader builds of many other soldiers. This should be interesting, he thought, expecting a competent but unremarkable demonstration. What happened next challenged every assumption Blake had made about physical capability and military bearing. Staff Sergeant Morales executed 50 perfect push-ups in a rhythm that never varied. Her form flawless, her breathing controlled, her movements economical and precise. But it wasn't just the number or the technique that caught Blake's attention. It was the way she performed them with a kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested this level of fitness was so routine it required no conscious effort. "Holy shit," whispered Private Cross, forgetting where he was for a moment. "Did you see that?" Blake had seen it, but he processed it differently than his companion. Rather than recognizing exceptional physical conditioning, he categorized it as the result of someone who had spent years doing the same exercises without the benefit of more sophisticated training methods. A gym rat, he decided, someone who had compensated for lack of natural ability through repetition and routine. "She's been doing this for years," he said dismissively to Cross. "When you don't have anything else to focus on, you might as well stay in shape." But Blake's dismissal became harder to maintain as the morning progressed. During the sit-up demonstration, Staff Sergeant Morales again performed with the same mechanical precision, executing movements that would have challenged soldiers half her age. Her 2-mile run time, which Blake observed from his position as a pace setter for the slower recruits, was faster than his own personal best. "Maybe she's some kind of fitness specialist," Cross suggested, clearly struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with Blake's assessment of the staff sergeant as a bureaucratic placeholder. "Physical fitness is the easy part," Blake replied, though his tone carried less conviction than it had earlier. "Anyone can get in shape if they don't have more important things to worry about. The real test is leadership under pressure, tactical thinking, the ability to make decisions that matter." As if responding to his unspoken challenge, the afternoon training shifted to tactical exercises. The new recruits were divided into squads and given a series of problem-solving scenarios that tested their ability to work together, communicate effectively, and adapt to changing circumstances. Blake naturally positioned himself as a leader, his OCS training and natural confidence making him the obvious choice for his squad. The exercise seemed straightforward enough: navigate through a series of obstacles while maintaining communication with other squads, adapt to simulated enemy contact, and achieve specific objectives within a time limit. Blake approached it with the same systematic thinking that had made him successful in academic and athletic competition. Staff Sergeant Morales moved through the training area like a ghost, appearing at different positions to observe each squad's progress. She didn't interfere with their problem-solving process, but Blake could feel her presence tracking their movements, noting their decisions, evaluating their performance in ways that went beyond simple completion of assigned tasks. Blake's squad performed well, completing their objectives efficiently and maintaining good communication throughout the exercise. He felt satisfied with their performance and confident that he had demonstrated the kind of leadership that would set him apart from his peers. But as they gathered for the after-action review, he noticed something that bothered him. Staff Sergeant Morales was conducting individual debriefs with each squad leader, and Blake could see that her conversations with the other privates were lasting much longer than he had expected. She wasn't just checking off completion boxes or offering generic praise. She was asking detailed questions about decision-making processes, alternative approaches, and lessons learned from the exercise. When his turn came, Blake expected a brief acknowledgement of his squad's successful performance. Instead, Staff Sergeant Morales asked him to walk through his decision-making process step by step, questioning assumptions he had made, exploring alternatives he had dismissed, and challenging him to think about aspects of the exercise he had overlooked. "Your squad achieved all assigned objectives," she said, her voice neutral and professional. But you made several decisions that could have been problematic in a real-world scenario. Can you identify them? Blake felt a flash of irritation. His squad had performed better than most of the others, had completed every task efficiently, and had maintained good communication throughout. What more could she possibly want? "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Sergeant," he replied, his tone carrying a slight edge. "We completed all objectives within the time limit and maintained effective communication with other squads." "You did," she agreed. "But effectiveness isn't just about completing assigned tasks. It's about understanding the broader context, considering unintended consequences, and adapting to information that doesn't fit your initial assessment." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales asking questions that Blake found increasingly difficult to answer. She wasn't criticizing his performance directly, but she was exposing gaps in his thinking that he hadn't recognized, highlighting assumptions he had made without adequate information, and demonstrating that successful completion of an exercise didn't necessarily indicate optimal decision-making. By the time the debrief ended, Blake felt unsettled in a way he hadn't experienced since his early days in college athletics. Staff Sergeant Morales hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown any emotion, hadn't even directly criticized his performance. But she had made him question his own competence in ways that felt both unfamiliar and uncomfortable. "What was that about?" Cross asked as they walked back to the barracks. "You did great out there. Better than any of the other squad leaders." Blake nodded, but the staff sergeant's questions continued to echo in his mind. He was used to feedback. That was either praise for success or criticism for failure. This was something different, a kind of analysis that suggested success could be achieved through flawed thinking, and that good outcomes didn't necessarily indicate good decisions. As evening approached, and the recruits settled into their barracks routine, Blake found himself thinking about Staff Sergeant Morales in ways that contradicted his initial assessment. Her physical fitness was undeniably exceptional. Her tactical questioning had been sophisticated and challenging, and her ability to manage 32 confused privates suggested organizational skills that went far beyond routine administrative work. But rather than revising his opinion of her capabilities, Blake chose to interpret these observations through the lens of his existing assumptions. She was clearly competent at her job, he decided, but competence in training exercises didn't necessarily translate to real-world leadership. Physical fitness was admirable, but it didn't indicate strategic thinking. Tactical questioning was useful, but it was probably something she had learned through years of repetition rather than natural ability. In Blake's mind, Staff Sergeant Morales remained a capable but ultimately limited professional who had found her niche in the comfortable routine of training exercises. What he couldn't see, what he wasn't prepared to see, was that he was being evaluated by someone whose understanding of tactical thinking, physical courage, and real-world leadership had been forged in circumstances that would have tested the limits of human endurance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Blake thought he knew about military service, leadership, and the true meaning of strength. The third day at Fort Clearwater brought with it a confidence that Blake had been building since his arrival. He had established himself as the unofficial leader among the new recruits, his academic credentials and athletic background serving as natural qualifications that others seemed to accept without question. Private Cross had become his lieutenant, eagerly spreading Blake's assessments of their training environment to anyone who would listen. "The thing about places like this," Blake explained to a small group gathered around his bunk during the evening, "downtime, is that they're designed for people who've accepted their limitations. Look at our instructors. They're competent enough at what they do, but none of them are going anywhere. They're career enlisted who found their comfort zone." Private Jessica Parker, who had been listening from her nearby bunk, looked up from the manual she was studying. "I don't know, Blake. Some of these NCOs seem pretty sharp. Sergeant Morales especially. Did you see how she handled that tactical exercise yesterday? Blake's expression shifted to the condescending smile he reserved for people who couldn't see the bigger picture. Parker, you're confusing competence with excellence. Sergeant Morales is good at her job, I'll give her that. But her job is basically running the same training exercises over and over again. It's not exactly rocket science. She asked some pretty tough questions during the debrief, Parker persisted. Made me think about things I hadn't considered. That's what I'm talking about, Blake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. She's had years to memorize the right questions to ask. It's not insight, it's just experience with the same routine. What Blake didn't realize was that Staff Sergeant Morales was conducting her own assessment of the group dynamics that were forming among the new recruits. She had observed this pattern dozens of times over her years in the military. Talented individuals who confused natural ability with leadership, who assumed that early success translated to unlimited potential, and who built their confidence on the diminishment of others. From her position at the duty desk, she could hear portions of Blake's evening lectures to his fellow recruits. His voice carried the kind of casual authority that came from never having been seriously challenged, and his assessments of the training cadre revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually meant. He's going to be a problem, Sergeant First Class Anthony Washington observed, approaching Morales's position with 2 cups of coffee. Washington had been at Fort Clearwater for 3 years and had developed a reliable instinct for identifying recruits who would either excel or flame out spectacularly. He's got potential, Morales replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. But he doesn't understand what he doesn't know yet. Think he'll figure it out before he gets himself or someone else in trouble. Morales considered the question, her eyes moving to the barracks where Blake's voice continued to dominate the evening discussion. That depends on how much he's willing to learn when the learning gets uncomfortable. The next morning brought weapons training, an area where Blake expected to excel based on his background, with firearms from hunting trips with his father and recreational shooting during college. The M4 carbine was a familiar platform, and he approached the training with the same confidence he had shown in previous exercises. Staff Sergeant Morales conducted the initial safety briefing with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, covering basic handling procedures, range safety protocols, and the fundamental principles of marksmanship. Blake listened with half his attention, already confident in his understanding of the material, but as the training progressed, he noticed something that bothered him. While he was achieving respectable groupings on the target range, Staff Sergeant Morales was demonstrating shooting skills that went far beyond what he had expected from someone he had categorized as a routine training instructor. During the instructor demonstration, she fired 20 rounds into a target at 300 meters, producing a grouping that would have challenged competitive shooters. Her stance was perfect, her breathing controlled, her trigger discipline flawless. But what impressed Blake despite himself was the economy of her movements. No wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustments, just the mechanical precision of someone who had made these movements thousands of times under conditions far more challenging than a controlled training range. Show off, he muttered to Cross, who was struggling with his own marksmanship. Probably spends all her free time on the range, since she doesn't have anything else to do. But Blake's dismissal became harder to maintain when Staff Sergeant Morales began working with individual recruits who were having difficulty with their shooting. Her instruction was patient, detailed, and remarkably effective. She could diagnose shooting problems with a glance, adjust a recruit's stance with a single correction, and help struggling shooters improve their groupings within minutes. "How did you know to adjust my grip like that?" Private Rodriguez asked after achieving his first acceptable grouping of the day. "I've been struggling with this for weeks." "Experience," Staff Sergeant Morales replied simply. "When you've seen the same problems enough times, the solutions become obvious." Blake watched this interaction with growing irritation. It was one thing for Staff Sergeant Morales to be personally skilled. Anyone could develop proficiency through repetition. But her ability to diagnose and correct other people's problems suggested a level of understanding that went beyond mechanical competence. The afternoon training moved to tactical movement, an area where Blake felt confident his OCS training would give him a significant advantage. The exercise involved moving through a simulated urban environment, using cover and concealment to avoid detection while achieving specific objectives. Blake approached the exercise with the systematic thinking he had learned in his military education, carefully planning his route, identifying potential hazards, and coordinating with his team members. His performance was solid, methodical, and successful by any reasonable standard. But as he watched Staff Sergeant Morales move through the same course during the instructor demonstration, Blake experienced something he hadn't felt since his early days of college. Athletics, the recognition that he was watching someone operate at a level he hadn't even known existed. She moved through the tactical course like water flowing around obstacles, her movements so fluid and natural that they seemed almost choreographed. But Blake could see that every step, every pause, every change of direction was calculated for maximum efficiency and minimal exposure. She wasn't just completing the exercise. She was demonstrating a mastery of tactical movement that suggested experience in environments where mistakes carried consequences far beyond training scores. "Jesus," whispered Private Cross, who had been watching the same demonstration. Where did she learn to move like that? Blake felt a familiar flush of irritation. "It's just training, Cross. She's probably been doing this exercise for years." When you repeat something enough times, it becomes second nature. But even as he spoke, Blake knew his explanation didn't fully account for what he had just witnessed. There was something about Staff Sergeant Morales' tactical movement that suggested experience beyond the controlled environment of training exercises. The way she processed information, the speed of her decision-making, the absolute confidence of her movements. These weren't the characteristics of someone who had learned tactics from a manual. During the after-action review, Staff Sergeant Morales again conducted individual debriefs with each team leader. When Blake's turn came, he was prepared for more of the challenging questions she had asked during previous training sessions. "Your team achieved all objectives and maintained good tactical discipline," she began, her tone neutral and professional. "But I noticed you made several movement choices that could have been optimized. Can you walk me through your decision-making process?" Blake felt his jaw tighten. His team had performed well, had completed every assigned task, and had maintained better tactical discipline than most of the other squads. What more could she possibly want? "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Sergeant," he replied, his tone carrying a note of challenge that he immediately regretted. "We completed all objectives without compromising operational security." "You did," she agreed. "But effectiveness isn't just about completing assigned tasks without getting caught. It's about understanding the environment, anticipating problems, and maintaining the flexibility to adapt when conditions change." The conversation continued for 15 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales asking questions that exposed gaps in Blake's tactical thinking he hadn't recognized. She wasn't criticizing his performance directly, but she was demonstrating that successful completion of an exercise didn't necessarily indicate optimal tactical decision-making. By the time the debrief ended, Blake felt a level of frustration he hadn't experienced since his freshman year of college. Staff Sergeant Morales hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown any emotion, hadn't even directly criticized his performance. But she had made him question his own competence in ways that felt both unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. "What's her problem?" Blake asked Cross as they walked back to the barracks. "I performed better than anyone else in the exercise, and she acts like I screwed up." "Maybe she's trying to push you because she sees potential," Cross suggested, though. His tone indicated he was more interested in maintaining Blake's favor than offering genuine analysis. "Or maybe she's one of those instructors who gets off on making people feel stupid," Blake replied. "Some people who've never done anything important themselves try to compensate by tearing down people who actually have potential." That evening, as the recruits settled into their barracks routine, Blake found himself thinking about Staff Sergeant Morales in ways that increased his irritation rather than his understanding. Her exceptional performance in every training area was undeniable, but Blake chose to interpret these observations through the lens of his existing assumptions rather than revising his opinion of her capabilities. She was clearly competent at her job, he decided, but competence in controlled training exercises didn't necessarily translate to real-world leadership. Her tactical questioning was sophisticated, but it was probably something she had learned through years of repetition rather than natural ability. Her shooting skills were impressive, but they were the result of having nothing else to focus on. Besides perfecting routine military tasks. In Blake's mind, Staff Sergeant Morales remained a capable, but ultimately limited professional who had found her niche in the comfortable routine of training exercises. What he couldn't see, what he wasn't prepared to see, was that he was being evaluated by someone whose understanding of tactical thinking, marksmanship, and real-world leadership had been forged in circumstances that would have tested the limits of human courage. The seeds of confrontation had been planted, and Blake's growing frustration with being challenged by someone he considered beneath his potential was pushing him toward a reckoning that would change everything he thought he knew about military service. The morning of the 5th day at Fort Clearwater brought an announcement that sent a ripple of anticipation through Alpha Company. Captain Rebecca Hayes stood before the assembled recruits, her expression more serious than they had seen during their previous training sessions. "Today's exercise will be different from what you've experienced so far," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in real-world situations. "You'll be participating in a 72-hour field training exercise. That will test everything you've learned about tactical movement, fieldcraft, problem-solving under pressure, and leadership." Blake felt a surge of excitement. This was what he had been waiting for, a chance to demonstrate his capabilities in a scenario that would challenge him beyond the routine training exercises they had been conducting. Finally, an opportunity to show what real leadership looked like when the stakes were raised. "You'll be divided into 2 teams, Captain Hayes continued. "Each team will have specific objectives to achieve while avoiding detection by opposing forces. The exercise will simulate combat conditions as closely as possible within safety parameters. Success will be measured not just by objective completion, but by how well you adapt to changing circumstances, work as a team, and make decisions under pressure." Staff Sergeant Morales stood quietly to one side, observing the recruits' reactions to the announcement. Blake noticed her watching him specifically, and he interpreted her attention as recognition of his potential leadership in the upcoming exercise. What he didn't realize was that she was conducting a different kind of assessment, evaluating whether he had learned enough from the previous training to handle the increased responsibility that would come with the field exercise. The team selection process was handled through a combination of random assignment and careful balancing of skills and personalities. Blake found himself designated as one of the team leaders, a recognition that filled him with satisfaction. His team included Private Cross, Private Parker, and 13 other recruits who represented a mix of backgrounds and capabilities. Team Alpha, you'll be working with Staff Sergeant Morales as your evaluator and safety officer, Captain Hayes announced. "She'll be observing your performance and providing guidance when necessary, but the leadership and decision-making will be entirely up to your designated team leaders." Blake's initial reaction was disappointment. He had hoped to work with one of the more senior NCOs, Master Sergeant Foster or Sergeant First Class Washington, who might provide more challenging evaluation and feedback. Being assigned to Staff Sergeant Morales felt like being given the junior varsity treatment when he was ready for varsity competition. "Great," he muttered to Cross as they gathered their equipment. "We get the training wheels instructor while the other team probably gets someone who's actually seen combat." What Blake didn't know was that Captain Hayes had specifically assigned Staff Sergeant Morales to Team Alpha because she had identified Blake as the recruit most likely to encounter serious problems during the exercise. His combination of natural ability, academic training, and complete lack of real-world experience made him a risk that required careful management. The exercise began at dawn, with Team Alpha moving into a wooded area approximately 15 miles from the main base. Their first objective was to establish a concealed observation post, gather intelligence on simulated enemy positions, and transmit their findings back to headquarters without being detected. Blake approached the mission with the systematic thinking he had learned in OCS, carefully analyzing the terrain, identifying potential hazards, and developing what he considered to be a comprehensive plan. His confidence was high, his team was motivated, and he felt prepared to demonstrate the kind of leadership that would set him apart from his peers. Staff Sergeant Morales moved with the team, but maintained the distance appropriate for an evaluator. She said nothing during Blake's initial briefing, made no suggestions about his tactical plan, and gave no indication of her assessment of his decision-making. To Blake, her silence seemed like professional acknowledgement that he was handling the situation appropriately. The first 6 hours went smoothly. Team Alpha moved through the forested terrain with good tactical discipline, established their observation post according to Blake's specifications, and began the intelligence gathering phase of their mission. Blake felt confident in his leadership and satisfied with his team's performance, but as the day progressed, conditions began to change in ways that challenged Blake's initial assumptions. The weather shifted unexpectedly, bringing rain that reduced visibility and made movement more difficult. Radio communications became intermittent, forcing the team to adapt their reporting schedule. Most challenging of all, the simulated enemy forces began conducting counter-reconnaissance operations that put Team Alpha at risk of detection. These changes required the kind of adaptive leadership that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training manuals. Blake found himself facing decisions that involved incomplete information, competing priorities, and consequences that went beyond simple success or failure in a training exercise. "We need to move the observation post," Private Parker suggested. During a brief team meeting, "The enemy patrol pattern has changed, and our current position is too exposed." Blake's initial reaction was to dismiss the suggestion. Moving the observation post would require abandoning the careful preparation they had done, would risk detection during the movement, and would delay their intelligence-gathering mission. In his analysis, the risks outweighed the benefits. "We're staying put," he decided. "We've got good concealment here, and moving now would expose us to greater risk than staying in position." Staff Sergeant Morales, who had been quietly observing the discussion, said nothing. But Blake noticed her making notes on a small pad. And something about her expression suggested she was recording more than just routine observations. 3 hours later, Blake's decision proved problematic. The enemy patrol pattern had indeed changed, and Team Alpha's position became increasingly vulnerable to detection. What had been a secure observation post in the morning was now a tactical liability that threatened to compromise their entire mission. "Sir, we need to move now," Private Rodriguez urged. "If we stay here much longer, we're going to get spotted." Blake found himself facing a decision that challenged everything he thought he knew about leadership. Moving now would mean admitting that his initial assessment had been wrong, that he had failed to adapt to changing conditions, and that subordinates had recognized problems he had missed. "We're committed to this position," he said, his voice carrying more authority than confidence. "Moving now would be more dangerous than staying put." Staff Sergeant Morales finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Private Blake, can I speak with you privately?" They moved to a position about 50 meters from the rest of the team, far enough to speak without being overheard, but close enough to maintain visual contact with the observation post. "What's your assessment of the current tactical situation?" she asked, her tone neutral and professional. Blake felt a familiar flash of irritation. "We're in a good position with adequate concealment. Moving now would expose us to unnecessary risk, and if the enemy patrol pattern continues to shift toward our position, then we'll deal with that when it happens. You can't make decisions based on hypothetical scenarios." Staff Sergeant Morales was quiet for a moment, studying Blake's face with the same patient attention she had shown during previous training sessions. "Leadership isn't about being right all the time, Private. It's about making the best decisions you can with the information available and adapting when conditions change." "I understand that, Sergeant. But changing course every time someone suggests a different approach isn't leadership, it's indecision. And sticking with a plan that's no longer viable isn't leadership either, it's stubbornness." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales asking questions that exposed the flaws in Blake's tactical thinking without directly criticizing his decisions. She wasn't telling him what to do, but she was forcing him to confront the consequences of his choices. When they returned to the team, Blake found himself in an impossible position. His tactical analysis suggested they should move, but his pride demanded that he stick with his original decision. The team was looking to him for leadership, but he was paralyzed by the conflict between what he knew was right and what he wanted to be right. "We're moving," he finally announced, his voice carrying none of the confidence he had shown earlier. "New position, 500 meters north." The movement was executed successfully, but Blake knew that everyone on the team, including Staff Sergeant Morales, understood that he had been forced to change course by circumstances rather than choosing to adapt proactively. It was a lesson in leadership that no textbook could have taught him, and one that left him feeling more uncertain about his capabilities than he had felt since arriving at Fort Clearwater. As Team Alpha settled into their new position, Blake found himself looking at Staff Sergeant Morales with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. She had been right about the tactical situation, had identified problems he had missed, and had forced him to confront the limitations of his own decision-making. But rather than acknowledging her expertise, Blake chose to interpret the encounter as evidence that she was more concerned with being right than with supporting his leadership development. In his mind, she remained a competent but ultimately limited professional who had used her experience to embarrass him rather than help him grow. The field exercise was far from over, and Blake sensed that more challenges were coming. But he remained convinced that his fundamental assessment of Staff Sergeant Morales was correct, even as the evidence continued to mount that he was dealing with someone whose understanding of tactical leadership went far beyond routine training. Exercises. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Blake to choose between his pride and his education, between his assumptions and the reality of what military service actually demanded from those who would lead others in life or death. Situations. The second day of the field training exercise began with Blake's confidence significantly shaken from the previous day's events. He had slept poorly in the makeshift shelter his team had constructed, his mind replaying the tactical decisions that had forced him to change course under Staff Sergeant Morales' questioning. Rather than using the experience as a learning opportunity, Blake had spent the night constructing elaborate justifications for his actions and reasons why his initial assessment had been correct, despite the evidence to the contrary. "She's playing games," he complained to Cross during their pre-dawn watch. "Setting up scenarios designed to make me look bad rather than actually evaluating leadership potential." Cross, who had witnessed the previous day's events with growing concern about Blake's decision-making, nodded uncertainly. "Maybe she's just thorough. I mean, she seemed to know what she was talking about when she suggested we move positions." Anyone can second-guess decisions after the fact, Blake replied. Dismissively. Real leadership means making tough choices and sticking with them, even when other people don't understand the reasoning. What Blake didn't realize was that Staff Sergeant Morales had spent the night conducting her own assessment of the day's events. Her evaluation notes contained detailed observations about each team member's performance, but Blake's file was receiving particular attention. She had identified him as someone with significant potential, who was being limited by his inability to accept guidance and adapt to new information. The morning's mission involved a more complex scenario: infiltrating a simulated enemy compound, gathering specific intelligence, and extracting without detection. It was the kind of operation that required careful planning, precise execution, and the ability to adapt quickly when conditions changed. Blake approached the mission briefing with renewed determination to prove his leadership capabilities. He had spent considerable time developing what he considered to be a comprehensive tactical plan, complete with contingency options and detailed timing sequences. His confidence was restored, and he was ready to demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that would vindicate his assessment of his own potential. Staff Sergeant Morales listened to his briefing without comment, her expression neutral as Blake outlined his approach to the mission. She asked no questions during the presentation, made no suggestions about alternative approaches, and gave no indication of her assessment of his planning process. Any questions about the mission plan? Blake asked his team after completing the briefing. Private Parker raised her hand tentatively. What if the enemy patrol schedule changes like it did yesterday? Shouldn't we have more flexibility in our timing? Blake felt a familiar flash of irritation. The plan accounts for normal variations in patrol schedules. If we start second-guessing every aspect of our approach, we'll never be able to execute effectively. But what if? Parker began. Parker, trust the plan, Blake interrupted. I've analyzed all the available information and developed an approach that maximizes our chances of success. Leadership means making decisions and sticking with them, not constantly changing course based on hypothetical scenarios. Staff Sergeant Morales, who had been quietly observing the discussion, made a note on her pad. Blake noticed her writing and interpreted it as acknowledgement of his decisive leadership style. The mission began with Team Alpha moving toward their objective under cover of darkness. Blake's initial confidence was high. His team was following orders effectively, and the approach phase proceeded according to his carefully developed timeline. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but as they neared the target area, Blake began to notice details that didn't align with his pre-mission intelligence. The enemy patrol patterns were different from what he had expected. Security measures were more extensive than anticipated, and the terrain presented challenges that hadn't been apparent during his planning phase. Sir, the security setup is different from what we briefed, Private Rodriguez whispered during a brief halt. Maybe we should adjust our approach. Blake's immediate reaction was to dismiss the suggestion. Adjusting the plan would mean admitting that his intelligence analysis had been incomplete, that his planning had been inadequate, and that subordinates were identifying problems he had missed. We're sticking with the plan, he decided. Intelligence is never perfect, and good leaders adapt to conditions on the ground without abandoning their overall strategy. Staff Sergeant Morales, who had been moving with the team but maintaining appropriate distance, appeared beside Blake's position. Private Blake, what's your assessment of the current situation? We're proceeding according to plan, Sergeant. Minor variations in enemy disposition, but nothing that requires major adjustments to our approach. And if those variations indicate a more significant change in the security posture, Blake felt his jaw tighten. Then we'll deal with that when it becomes necessary. You can't plan for every possible contingency. Staff Sergeant Morales was quiet for a moment, studying the target area with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. What do you think those variations might indicate about the enemy's awareness of our presence? The question hit Blake like a physical blow. He had been so focused on executing his plan that he hadn't considered the possibility that the changes in enemy behavior might be a response to their infiltration attempt. His tactical analysis had been purely mechanical, focused on completing assigned tasks rather than understanding the broader tactical situation. We haven't been detected," he stammered, suddenly uncertain about his assessment. "How do you know?" Blake found himself unable to answer. His confidence, which had been restored during the planning phase, began to crumble as he realized that his understanding of the tactical situation was far less complete than he had assumed. The mission continued, but Blake's leadership became increasingly tentative and reactive. Every decision felt like a potential mistake. Every suggestion from his team members felt like criticism of his competence. And every question from Staff Sergeant Morales felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine his authority. When Team Alpha finally reached their extraction point, they had successfully completed their assigned objectives, but Blake knew that his performance had been far from exemplary. His plan had worked, but only because the exercise parameters had been forgiving enough to accommodate his tactical mistakes. During the after-action review, Staff Sergeant Morales conducted her usual individual debriefs with each team member. When Blake's turn came, he was prepared for the challenging questions that had become routine, but he was not prepared for the depth of her analysis. "Your team achieved all assigned objectives," she began, "but I'm concerned about your decision-making process. You seemed resistant to adapting your plan when conditions changed." "I believe in decisive leadership," Blake replied, his tone carrying a defensive edge. "Constantly changing course based on minor variations in conditions isn't leadership. It's indecision. And ignoring information that contradicts your initial assessment isn't leadership either. It's stubbornness." The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales systematically exposing every flaw in Blake's tactical thinking, every assumption he had made without adequate justification, and every opportunity he had missed to improve his team's performance. She wasn't being harsh or critical, but she was being thorough in a way that left Blake feeling completely exposed. "You have significant potential," she concluded. "But potential without the willingness to learn and adapt is just wasted talent. Real leadership requires the humility to acknowledge when you're wrong, and the courage to change course when conditions demand it." Blake felt a level of frustration and embarrassment that he hadn't experienced since his freshman year of college. Rather than accepting Staff Sergeant Morales's feedback as professional guidance, he interpreted it as a personal attack on his competence and potential. "I understand your perspective, Sergeant," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But I think there's a difference between constructive feedback and constantly undermining someone's confidence." Staff Sergeant Morales looked at him directly, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying something that might have been disappointment. "Private Blake, my job is to help you become the best leader you can be. That means challenging you to grow beyond your current limitations, not confirming your existing assumptions about your capabilities." That evening, as Team Alpha settled into their bivouac for the night, Blake found himself surrounded by fellow recruits who were eager to hear his assessment of the day's events. Rather than reflecting on the lessons he might have learned, he chose to focus on what he perceived as Staff Sergeant Morales's unfair treatment of his leadership. "She's got it in for me," he told his audience, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found an explanation that preserved his self-image. "Some people can't stand to see others succeed, especially when they've never accomplished anything significant themselves." "Maybe she's just trying to make you better," Private Parker suggested tentatively. "Parker, you don't understand how this works," Blake replied condescendingly. "She's a career enlisted who's never been in a real leadership position. She spent her whole career taking orders from people like me, and now she's trying to prove something by making me look bad." Cross, who had been watching Blake's performance with growing concern, remained silent. He had begun to notice things about Staff Sergeant Morales that contradicted Blake's assessment. The way Master Sergeant Foster deferred to her judgment, the way Captain Hayes sought her input on tactical matters, the way she moved through challenging terrain with the confidence of someone who had done it under far more dangerous conditions. But Blake's explanations provided a comfortable narrative that allowed Cross to maintain his position in the group without having to confront the possibility that his mentor was fundamentally wrong about the situation. As the night wore on, Blake's complaints about Staff Sergeant Morales became more specific and more personal. He questioned her qualifications, criticized her training methods, and suggested that she was using her evaluation role to compensate for her own lack of real-world experience. What Blake didn't realize was that Staff Sergeant Morales was conducting her own quiet assessment of the group dynamics that were forming around his leadership. She had seen this pattern before: talented individuals who dealt with criticism by attacking the credibility of those who challenged them, who built their confidence by diminishing others rather than improving themselves. The final day of the field exercise would present one more opportunity for Blake to demonstrate growth and adaptability. But his increasing resentment towards Staff Sergeant Morales was pushing him toward a confrontation that would force him to choose between his pride and the possibility of becoming the leader he claimed to be. The stage was set for a reckoning that would reveal whether Blake's potential could overcome his arrogance, or whether his inability to accept guidance would limit him to becoming just another cautionary tale about wasted talent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The final day of the field training exercise was supposed to be a culminating event that would test everything the recruits had learned about leadership, tactical thinking, and teamwork under pressure. But for Blake, it had become something else entirely. A chance to prove that his assessment of Staff Sergeant Morales was correct, and that her constant questioning of his decisions was based on jealousy rather than professional expertise. As Team Alpha prepared for their final mission, Blake found himself consumed not with tactical planning but with building a case against his evaluator. Every interaction, every question, every suggestion she made was filtered through his growing conviction that she was deliberately trying to undermine his success. "Watch how she operates today," he told Cross and Private Morrison during their pre-mission briefing. "She'd try to make me second-guess every decision, not because there's anything wrong with my approach, but because she can't stand to see someone with real potential succeed." The final mission was the most complex they had faced, a multi-phase operation that required infiltration, intelligence gathering, target elimination, and extraction, all while avoiding detection by a larger enemy force. It was the kind of scenario that tested not just tactical knowledge but the ability to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. Blake approached the mission with a confidence that had been artificially inflated by his success at convincing his teammates that Staff Sergeant Morales was the problem rather than his own performance. He had developed what he considered to be a sophisticated tactical plan, complete with detailed timing sequences and contingency options that accounted for various scenarios. But as the mission briefing progressed, Blake began to notice something that bothered him. Staff Sergeant Morales was asking questions that went far beyond the scope of a training exercise. Her inquiries about enemy capabilities, terrain analysis, and tactical options demonstrated a level of understanding that seemed inconsistent with someone whose experience was limited to routine training scenarios. "What's your assessment of the enemy's likely response to indirect fire?" she asked during the planning phase. Blake paused, uncertain how to respond. The question assumed a level of tactical complexity that went beyond what he had considered. In his planning, "We're not expecting to encounter indirect fire during this exercise. But if you did, what would be your response?" "I would take appropriate cover and continue with the mission." Staff Sergeant Morales made a note on her pad. her expression neutral but her eyes carrying something that might have been disappointment. And if the enemy response included coordinated indirect fire with ground assault? Blake felt his confidence begin to waver. These weren't the kinds of questions that training instructors typically asked. They suggested experience with tactical situations that went far beyond controlled exercises, knowledge of enemy capabilities that came from real-world encounters rather than training manuals. "Sergeant, are these scenarios we're likely to encounter during the exercise?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. "You tell me, Private. What do you think?" The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales asking increasingly sophisticated questions about tactical scenarios that Blake had never encountered in his military education. Her inquiries revealed gaps in his knowledge that he hadn't recognized, challenged assumptions he had made without adequate justification, and demonstrated that his understanding of tactical operations was far more limited than he had believed. Rather than acknowledging these limitations and using them as learning opportunities, Blake chose to interpret Staff Sergeant Morales's questions as evidence that she was showing off knowledge that was irrelevant to their current situation. In his mind, her sophisticated understanding of tactical scenarios was just another example of someone who had spent too much time studying theory rather than developing practical leadership skills. "She's trying to make me look bad by asking questions that go beyond the scope of the exercise," he complained to his team during a brief break. "It's a classic tactic used by people who want to demonstrate their theoretical knowledge at the expense of practical leadership." Private Parker, who had been listening with growing concern, spoke up tentatively. "Blake, maybe she's trying to prepare us for more complex scenarios. Some of those questions seemed pretty important." "Parker, you're missing the point," Blake replied with the condescending tone he reserved for people who couldn't see the bigger picture. "She's not preparing us for anything. She's trying to prove that she knows more than we do about tactical theory. It's an ego trip, not professional development." But Blake's dismissal was becoming harder to maintain as the day progressed. During the mission execution phase, Staff Sergeant Morales demonstrated abilities that went far beyond theoretical knowledge. She moved through the challenging terrain with the confidence of someone who had done it under far more dangerous conditions. Her awareness of tactical situations was immediate and intuitive, and her ability to anticipate problems seemed almost supernatural. When Team Alpha encountered an unexpected obstacle during their infiltration phase, Staff Sergeant Morales appeared beside Blake's position without making a sound. Her approach had been so quiet and skillful that Blake hadn't detected her movement until she was close enough to whisper. "What's your assessment of the situation?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Blake studied the obstacle ahead, a security checkpoint that hadn't been included in their pre-mission intelligence. His tactical plan hadn't accounted for this complication, and he found himself uncertain about the best approach. "We'll need to find an alternate route," he decided. Moving through the checkpoint would risk detection. "What about Overwatch?" Staff Sergeant Morales asked. "Have you considered the possibility that the checkpoint is designed to funnel movement toward a kill zone?" Blake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The possibility she had suggested hadn't occurred to him, but it represented exactly the kind of tactical thinking that could mean the difference between success and failure in a real-world situation. That's a possibility," he admitted reluctantly. "So, what's your plan?" Blake found himself facing a decision that challenged everything he thought he knew about tactical leadership. His original plan was no longer viable, but adapting to Staff Sergeant Morales' suggestion would mean acknowledging that his initial assessment had been incomplete. "We'll conduct reconnaissance of the alternate routes before committing to movement," he said, his voice carrying less confidence than he intended. "Good decision," Staff Sergeant Morales replied simply, but Blake noticed her making another note on her pad. The mission continued with Blake's leadership, becoming increasingly reactive rather than proactive. Every decision felt like a potential mistake. Every suggestion from Staff Sergeant Morales felt like evidence of his inadequacy. And every successful adaptation felt like a failure to anticipate problems that a better leader would have foreseen. When Team Alpha completed their mission objectives and reached the extraction point, Blake knew that his performance had been far from exemplary. His plan had worked, but only because Staff Sergeant Morales had guided him through tactical challenges that he hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have resolved effectively on his own. During the post-mission debrief, Blake found himself facing the most comprehensive evaluation of his leadership capabilities he had ever experienced. Staff Sergeant Morales didn't just review his tactical decisions, she analyzed his decision-making process, his ability to adapt to changing conditions, his willingness to accept input from subordinates, and his capacity to learn from mistakes. Your team achieved all assigned objectives, she began, but I'm concerned about your approach to leadership. You seem to view guidance as criticism and adaptation as weakness. I believe in decisive leadership, Blake replied, his tone carrying a defensive edge that he couldn't suppress. Constantly second-guessing decisions based on theoretical scenarios isn't leadership, it's paralysis. And ignoring information that challenges your initial assessment isn't leadership either, it's arrogance. The conversation continued for 45 minutes, with Staff Sergeant Morales systematically exposing every flaw in Blake's tactical thinking, every assumption he had made without adequate justification, and every opportunity he had missed to improve his team's performance. But more than that, she was challenging his fundamental understanding of what military leadership actually meant. Leadership isn't about being right all the time, she explained. It's about making the best decisions you can with the information available, learning from your mistakes, and adapting when conditions change. Pride and stubbornness aren't leadership qualities, they're character flaws that get people killed. Blake felt a level of frustration and resentment that he hadn't experienced since his early days of college athletics. Rather than accepting Staff Sergeant Morales's feedback as professional guidance from someone with superior experience, he interpreted it as a personal attack designed to undermine his confidence and potential. I understand your perspective, Sergeant, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. But I think there's a difference between constructive feedback and constantly tearing someone down to make yourself feel important. Staff Sergeant Morales looked at him directly, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying something that might have been sadness. Private Blake, my job is to help you become the best leader you can be. That means challenging you to grow beyond your current limitations, not confirming your existing assumptions about your capabilities. As the field exercise concluded and Team Alpha prepared to return to Fort Clearwater, Blake found himself more convinced than ever that Staff Sergeant Morales was the problem rather than his own performance. Her exceptional tactical knowledge, her sophisticated understanding of combat scenarios, and her ability to anticipate problems that he had missed, all of these were evidence, in his mind, of someone who was more interested in showing off than in developing junior leaders. The seeds of a confrontation had been planted, and Blake's growing resentment was pushing him toward a reckoning that would force him to choose between his pride and the possibility of learning from someone whose experience went far beyond anything he had encountered in his military education. What Blake didn't realize was that he was about to discover just how wrong his assumptions had been, and that his arrogance was about to collide with a reality that would change everything he thought he knew about military service, leadership, and the true meaning of courage. The week following the field training exercise brought an unexpected announcement that sent ripples of anticipation through Alpha Company. Captain Hayes stood before the assembled recruits, her expression carrying the kind of gravity that suggested significant developments ahead. Next Friday, we'll be hosting a visit from General Michael Harrison, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, she announced. This isn't a routine inspection. The General will be evaluating our training programs as part of a broader assessment of readiness standards across multiple installations. Blake felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for. A chance to demonstrate his leadership capabilities in front of senior officers who might recognize his potential and accelerate his path to advancement. Finally, someone with the authority to see past the petty politics of routine training and identify real leadership material. The General will be observing all aspects of our training operations, Captain Hayes continued. He'll be conducting interviews with selected personnel, reviewing training records, and assessing our overall readiness. I expect each of you to represent Alpha Company with the professionalism and competence you've been developing during your time here, Staff Sergeant. Morales stood quietly to one side, her expression neutral as she listened to the announcement. Blake noticed her apparent lack of concern about the upcoming visit and interpreted it as evidence that she was comfortable with the routine nature of her assignment. Unlike him, she probably had no aspirations beyond her current position and no anxiety about being evaluated by senior leadership. "This is perfect," Blake told Cross and Private Morrison during their evening discussion. Finally, someone who can see the bigger picture and recognize actual leadership potential. "Think you'll get a chance to talk with the General?" Cross asked. "I'm sure he'll want to speak with the recruits who've shown the most promise," Blake replied confidently. "And when he does, he'll see exactly what kind of leadership we're dealing with here." What Blake didn't realize was that the announcement of General Harrison's visit had triggered a different kind of preparation throughout the base. Master Sergeant Foster had immediately begun coordinating with Staff Sergeant Morales about logistical arrangements, but their discussions went far beyond routine visitor protocols. There was something in their planning that suggested this visit carried significance that went beyond a standard readiness assessment. "Are you prepared for this?" Foster asked Morales during a private conversation that Blake happened to overhear from the adjoining office. "As prepared as I can be," she replied. "It's been 18 months since anyone from Division has seen me. In this context, you know he's going to want to discuss your next assignment. I'm hoping he'll respect my choice to stay here." Blake found the conversation intriguing, but ultimately dismissed it as routine career planning between NCOs. Staff Sergeant Morales was probably worried about being transferred to another training assignment, and Master Sergeant Foster was helping her prepare for the discussion. It was exactly the kind of limited career planning he would expect from someone who had settled into a comfortable routine. The days leading up to General Harrison's visit were filled with intensive preparation. Every aspect of Alpha Company's operations was reviewed, refined, and rehearsed. Equipment was inspected and maintained to the highest standards. Training schedules were optimized, and personnel were briefed on protocols for interacting with senior officers. Blake threw himself into the preparation with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of attention to detail and commitment to excellence that would distinguish him from his peers. He volunteered for additional responsibilities, helped coordinate logistics for the visit, and made sure his own appearance and performance would be exemplary. Staff Sergeant Morales continued her usual duties with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout their training, but Blake noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more focused, more alert, and more concerned with details that had previously received routine attention. Her interactions with other NCOs carried attention that suggested the upcoming visit was more significant than a standard readiness assessment. "She's nervous," Blake observed to his informal audience during their evening discussion. "Probably worried that a real evaluation will expose the limitations of her training methods." "I don't know," Private Parker said tentatively. "She doesn't seem nervous to me. She seems prepared." Blake's expression shifted to the condescending smile he reserved for people who couldn't read situations correctly. "Parker, you're confusing preparation with competence. Anyone can get nervous and over-prepare for a visit from senior leadership. That doesn't mean they're actually ready for serious evaluation. But Blake's assessment was becoming harder to maintain as the week progressed. The level of preparation being conducted by Staff Sergeant Morales went far beyond what he would have expected from someone whose experience was limited to routine training operations. Her coordination with other departments, her attention to security protocols, and her familiarity with high-level visitor procedures suggested experience with situations that went well beyond standard training exercises. How does she know so much about VIP visit protocols? Private Rodriguez asked during a break in their preparation activities. Some of these procedures seem pretty specialized. She's probably handled similar visits before, Blake replied dismissively. Training bases get inspected regularly. After a few years, you learn the routine. But Blake's explanation didn't fully account for the level of sophistication in Staff Sergeant Morales' preparation. Her security briefings were more detailed than necessary for a routine visit. Her coordination with intelligence personnel seemed unusual for a training environment. And her familiarity with high-level protocol suggested experience that went beyond what most NCOs would encounter during standard assignments. The night before General Harrison's visit, Blake found himself unable to sleep. His mind raced with anticipation about the opportunities that might arise from his interaction with such senior leadership. He had prepared extensively for potential interviews, had rehearsed his responses to questions about his career goals and leadership philosophy, and had positioned himself to make the strongest possible impression. Across the base, Staff Sergeant Morales was conducting her own final preparations, but they were different from the routine logistics that Blake had been focusing on. She was reviewing files, making secure phone calls, and coordinating with personnel who weren't part of Alpha Company's normal operations. Her activity suggested that General Harrison's visit was something more than a routine readiness assessment. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Master Sergeant Foster asked as he found her working late in the company office. "I'm ready," she replied, but her tone carried a weight that suggested she was preparing for something more challenging than a standard visit from senior leadership. "He's going to want to know why you're still here, why you haven't accepted any of the assignments division has offered." Staff Sergeant Morales was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the darkened training areas where she had spent the past 18 months working with recruits who had no idea about her background. "This work is important, Sergeant. These soldiers deserve the best training we can give them, and I'm making a contribution here. But you could be making a contribution anywhere. Why choose to stay in a position that doesn't challenge you?" "Who says it doesn't challenge me?" she replied with a slight smile. "Some of the most difficult leadership challenges I've faced have been right here, working with recruits who think they know everything and haven't learned how to listen." Foster understood immediately that she was referring to Blake, whose arrogance and resistance to guidance had been a constant source of concern throughout his training. "Think tomorrow's visit will help him understand what he's been missing. That depends on whether he's ready to learn from being wrong about something this fundamental." As the base settled into its nighttime routine, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force Blake to confront the reality of his own assumptions. General Harrison's visit would bring with it revelations that would challenge everything he thought he knew about military service, leadership, and the true qualifications of the people who had been guiding his training. Blake spent the night dreaming of recognition and advancement, convinced that tomorrow would vindicate his assessment of his own potential and expose the limitations of those who had been evaluating him. He had no idea that he was about to discover just how wrong his assumptions had been, or that his arrogance was about to collide with a reality that would change everything he thought. He knew about the meaning of military service. The morning would bring revelations that would shatter his comfortable assumptions and force him to choose between his pride and the possibility of learning from someone whose experience and accomplishments went far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The question was whether he would be ready to accept those revelations, or whether his arrogance would blind him to the lessons that were about to be revealed. Staff Sergeant Morales had spent 18 months patiently working with recruits who had no idea about her background, giving them the benefit of her experience without expecting recognition or acknowledgement. Tomorrow would determine whether that investment in their development had been successful, or whether some lessons could only be learned through the humbling experience of discovering just how much they didn't know about the people who had been guiding them. The morning of General Harrison's visit dawned clear and crisp at Fort Clearwater, with Alpha Company assembled in perfect formation on the parade ground. Blake stood in the front row, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture exemplary, his confidence at an all-time high. This was his moment, the opportunity he had been waiting for to demonstrate his leadership potential to someone who could recognize real talent. Staff Sergeant Morales stood at her usual position with the other NCOs, her bearing professional and calm. But Blake noticed something different about her demeanor this morning. There was a tension in her posture, a heightened alertness that suggested she was preparing for something more significant than a routine visit from senior leadership. Formation, attention. Master Sergeant Foster's voice echoed across the parade. Ground as a convoy of military vehicles approached the main gate. Blake felt his heart rate increase as he recognized the flags and insignia that marked General Harrison's arrival. The convoy came to a halt, and Blake watched with fascination as the general's security detail established a perimeter before the senior officer emerged from his vehicle. General Harrison was exactly what Blake had expected, tall, distinguished, with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of military leadership. His uniform was adorned with ribbons and decorations that spoke of a career filled with significant achievements. "General on deck," Foster announced, and the entire formation snapped to an even more rigid attention. General Harrison approached the formation with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, his eyes moving systematically across the assembled personnel. Blake stood straighter, hoping to catch the general's attention and make a positive first impression. "Good morning, Alpha Company," General Harrison addressed the formation, his voice carrying the natural authority of senior command. "I'm here to evaluate your training programs and assess the quality of leadership development being conducted at Fort Clearwater." Blake felt a surge of anticipation. This was exactly the kind of evaluation he had been hoping for, a chance to demonstrate his capabilities to someone who could recognize his potential and accelerate his career advancement. General Harrison began his inspection, moving through the ranks with Captain Hayes and Master Sergeant Foster, asking questions about training procedures, equipment readiness, and personnel development. Blake watched eagerly, waiting for his opportunity to interact with the senior officer, but as the inspection continued, something unexpected happened. General Harrison's systematic review of the formation suddenly stopped when his eyes fell on Staff Sergeant Morales. Blake watched in fascination as the general's confident demeanor shifted to something approaching shock. "My God, General Harrison," sighed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the silent formation. "Isabella, is that really you?" The words hit the parade ground like a physical force. Blake felt his knees go weak as he witnessed something that challenged every assumption he had made about military protocol and hierarchy. General Harrison, a 3-star general who commanded thousands of troops, was staring at Staff Sergeant Morales with a mixture of recognition, respect, and something that looked like awe. "Good morning, General," Staff Sergeant Morales replied quietly, her voice steady despite the bombshell that had just exploded around her. "It's good to see you again, sir." What happened next shattered every convention of military protocol that Blake had ever learned. General Harrison, the commanding officer of the 82nd Airborne Division, rendered a crisp salute to Staff Sergeant Morales. Blake's vision blurred as he witnessed something that violated every understanding he had of military hierarchy a 3-star general saluting a staff sergeant. "Colonel Morales," General Harrison said, his voice filled with genuine warmth and respect. "I should have known you'd be here, training the next generation of soldiers." Blake's world completed its violent transformation. Colonel, not staff sergeant. Colonel, the fragments of everything he had observed over the past weeks came crashing together in a devastating revelation that left him feeling physically ill. "Sir," Colonel Morales replied, and Blake could see her glancing around the formation, noting the confusion and shock on the faces of the recruits who had been working with her for weeks. "I would prefer to keep my current assignment if that's acceptable." "Of course," General Harrison nodded, understanding immediately. "But surely they could have given you something more appropriate to your experience and qualifications." "I requested this assignment, sir. I believe I'm making an important contribution here." General Harrison smiled, the expression carrying years of shared experience that Blake couldn't begin to understand. "Still avoiding the spotlight, I see. Some things never change." The general turned to address the formation, his voice carrying across the parade ground with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "For those of you who don't know, you've been working alongside one of the most decorated soldiers in the United States Army. Colonel Isabella Morales is a recipient of the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in combat operations." Blake thought he might collapse. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor in combat. The recognition given to fewer than 3,500 people in the entire history of the United States military. And he had been mocking her, questioning her qualifications, suggesting that she was incompetent and limited. Colonel Morales was the architect of Operation Sanctuary. General Harrison continued, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "She led the rescue operation that saved 47 civilians from a Taliban compound in Afghanistan, holding off an entire enemy battalion single-handedly, while coordinating the evacuation of wounded non-combatants." Blake's legs gave out slightly, and he had to lock his knees to remain standing. Operation Sanctuary. He had heard whispers of that mission during his military education, a legendary rescue operation that had become the stuff of military folklore. The operator who had led that mission was standing 20 feet away from him, and he had been treating her like an incompetent training instructor. "The operation that most of you might have heard referred to as the Miracle of Kandahar," General Harrison explained. "When our country needed someone to do the impossible, they sent Colonel Morales. She spent 3 days behind enemy lines, coordinated with multiple agencies, and executed a rescue operation that military historians are still studying." Blake felt every joke, every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture from the past weeks flooding back in vivid, horrifying detail. He had been mocking not just an officer, but a living legend. Someone who had done things he couldn't even imagine, sacrificed in ways he would never understand. "Colonel Morales could be anywhere in the military," General Harrison continued. "She could be commanding a brigade, working at the Pentagon, or leading special operations units. Instead, she chose to be here, training recruits, because she believes in developing the next generation of military leaders." Throughout this revelation, Colonel Morales maintained her composure, standing at attention but looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. Blake could see that she was the same person who had been patiently working with him for weeks, but now he understood that her patience hadn't come from limited expectations. It had come from the kind of perspective that only someone who had faced life-and-death situations could possess. "Sir," Colonel Morales said quietly, "perhaps we could continue this conversation privately." "Of course," General Harrison agreed, gesturing toward the command building. "Captain Hayes, might we use your office?" As they walked toward the building, Colonel Morales passed directly by Blake's position. For a moment, their eyes met, and Blake saw something in her expression that he hadn't recognized before, not disappointment or anger, but a kind of patient sadness that suggested she had been hoping he would learn these lessons through growth, rather than humiliation. When the office door closed behind them, the formation remained at attention, but Blake could feel the weight of shocked silence pressing down on everyone present. Around him, his fellow recruits were processing the same devastating revelation that had just shattered his entire worldview. "I told you there was something different about her," Private Parker whispered, her voice barely audible. Blake couldn't respond. He stood paralyzed, replaying weeks of arrogance and disrespect, seeing each incident through the lens of this devastating new understanding. The woman he had dismissed as a limited training instructor was one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history. The scars he had probably noticed but dismissed were evidence of sacrifices that had saved lives he would never know about. Cross appeared beside him, his face pale with shock. "Blake, did you know? Did you have any idea?" Blake shook his head, unable to speak. He had spent weeks building a case against Colonel Morales, convincing himself and others that she was incompetent, limited, and jealous of his potential. Now he understood that every moment of her patience with his arrogance had been a gift he didn't deserve. Every instance of her guidance had been wisdom earned through experiences that would have destroyed lesser people. The formation was dismissed, but Blake remained standing in place, unable to move as the full weight of his mistakes crashed down on him. He had been given the opportunity to learn from one of the most accomplished soldiers in military history, and he had wasted it through his own pride and ignorance. The question now was whether he could find the courage to face what he had done, learn from this devastating revelation, and somehow begin the process of becoming the kind of soldier who might be worthy of the guidance he had been so carelessly dismissing. The reckoning had begun, and Blake was about to discover whether his character was strong enough to survive the confrontation with his own arrogance. The hour following General Harrison's revelation felt like the longest of Blake's life. He sat in the company day room, staring at the wall while his fellow recruits whispered among themselves about the bombshell that had just exploded their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their training environment. The words Medal of Honor and Operation Sanctuary echoed in his mind like a death knell for his pride. Private Cross sat beside him, his face still pale with shock. "Blake, man, are you okay? You look like you're going to be sick." Blake couldn't respond. Every interaction he had had with Colonel Morales over the past weeks was replaying in his mind with devastating clarity. Every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment when he had questioned her qualifications or suggested that she was incompetent, all of it directed at someone who had earned the nation's highest military honor for valor in combat. "I need to see the full story," Blake finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand what I've done." He made his way to the base library, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The librarian, Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, looked up as he entered, her expression carrying a mixture of sympathy and concern that suggested she had already heard about the morning's events. "Looking for information about Colonel Morales?" she asked gently. Blake nodded, not trusting his voice. "Most of the details are classified," Williams explained, "but there are some public records about Operation Sanctuary and the Medal of Honor citation." "Are you sure you want to see them?" "I need to," Blake replied. Williams led him to a secure terminal and helped him access the declassified portions of Colonel Morales' service record. What Blake found there made his stomach turn with shame and self-loathing. Colonel Isabella Morales had been deployed to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit tasked with high-risk rescue missions. During Operation Sanctuary, her team had been called to extract a group of aid workers and their families who had been captured by Taliban forces and were being held in a heavily fortified compound outside Kandahar. The mission had gone wrong from the beginning. Intelligence had been incomplete, enemy strength had been underestimated, and the rescue team had found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. When the extraction helicopters were forced to withdraw due to heavy enemy fire, Colonel Morales had made the decision to stay behind with the civilians while her team established a defensive perimeter. For 3 days, she had held that position against overwhelming odds. She had coordinated air support, directed medical aid to wounded civilians, and maintained communication with coalition forces while simultaneously fighting off repeated enemy assaults. The citation described her actions in clinical, military language that somehow made them even more extraordinary. Despite being wounded multiple times and facing enemy forces that outnumbered her team by more than 10 to 1, Colonel Morales maintained her position and continued to direct the protection of 47 non-combatants. Her tactical brilliance, extraordinary courage, and unwavering commitment to the protection of innocent life exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Blake read about the final assault when Taliban forces had overrun the outer perimeter and Colonel Morales had single-handedly held the inner defensive line while wounded civilians were evacuated to the extraction point. She had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and had continued fighting even after being declared medically unfit for combat. The operation had saved 47 lives, including 12 children. The cost had been devastating. Colonel Morales had spent 8 months in Walter Reed Medical Center recovering from her injuries, had undergone multiple surgeries, and had been forced to relearn basic motor functions due to nerve damage from her wounds. She could have retired, Master Sergeant Williams said quietly, watching Blake read through the records. Full disability, presidential recognition, any assignment she wanted. Instead, she chose to come back to active duty and requested assignment to a training unit. Why? Blake asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer. Because she believes in developing the next generation of soldiers. She thinks that's where she can make the most difference. Blake closed the files and sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he had learned. The scars he had probably noticed but dismissed were evidence of wounds sustained while saving the lives of innocent people. The tactical knowledge he had dismissed as showing off was expertise earned through life-and-death situations that would have broken most people. The patience she had shown with his arrogance was the gift of someone who had faced real challenges and understood that training recruits was more important than protecting her own ego. "I've been an idiot," he said finally. "You've been a typical recruit," Williams replied. "Arrogant, inexperienced, and convinced of your own importance. The difference is that most recruits figure out they're wrong before they spend weeks insulting a Medal of Honor recipient." Blake felt tears threatening, but he fought them back. Self-pity wouldn't help anyone, least of all the woman he had wronged through his ignorance and pride. "What can I do?" he asked. "That depends on whether you're ready to actually learn from this experience, or whether you're just feeling sorry for yourself." Blake considered the question seriously. He could feel the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him, but beneath the shame and embarrassment, he sensed something else, an opportunity to become the kind of person who might be worthy of the guidance he had been so carelessly dismissing. "I want to learn," he said finally. "I want to understand what I've been missing." Then you need to start by acknowledging that everything you thought you knew about leadership, military service, and personal character has been wrong. Can you do that? Blake nodded, feeling the last vestiges of his arrogance crumble away. "Yes, ma'am." "Good, because Colonel Morales is going to be your instructor for the rest of your training, and if you're smart, you'll spend every moment trying to absorb whatever wisdom she's willing to share with someone who's spent weeks proving he doesn't deserve it." That evening, Blake found himself standing outside Colonel Morales's quarters, rehearsing what he would say. He had spent hours preparing for this conversation, trying to find words that could adequately express his regret and his desire to make amends. When she opened the door, Colonel Morales looked exactly as she had every day for the past weeks. Professional, composed, and patient. But now Blake could see things he had missed before. The slight stiffness in her movement that suggested old injuries. The way her eyes automatically assessed her surroundings with the awareness of someone who had learned to expect danger. The quiet confidence that came from having faced the worst possible circumstances and emerged victorious. "Private Blake," she said simply, "I was expecting you." "Colonel, I owe you an apology," Blake began, his voice tight with emotion. "I've been arrogant, disrespectful, and completely wrong about everything. I don't know how to make up for what I've done, but I want to try." Colonel Morales stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Her quarters were simple and functional, but Blake noticed details he would have missed before. Photographs of soldiers she had served with, commendations from operations he would never hear about, and books on military history and leadership that suggested a lifetime of study and reflection. "Sit down, Blake," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Let's talk about what you've learned and what you're going to do with that knowledge." The conversation that followed lasted for 2 hours and changed Blake's understanding of everything he thought he knew about military service, leadership, and the true meaning of character. Colonel Morales didn't lecture him or make him feel worse about his mistakes. Instead, she helped him understand why he had made those mistakes and what he could do to ensure he never made them again. "Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room," she explained. "It's about being smart enough to listen to people who know more than you do, brave enough to admit when you're wrong, and committed enough to put the mission and your people ahead of your own ego." By the time Blake left her quarters, he had begun to understand that his real education was just beginning. The next phase of his training would be about more than military tactics or technical skills. It would be about learning to become the kind of person who could earn the respect of someone like Colonel Morales, through actions rather than words. The reckoning was complete, but Blake's transformation was just beginning. He had discovered that some of the most important lessons could only be learned through the humbling experience of discovering just how wrong you could be about the people who were trying to help you become better than you ever imagined possible. The weeks following Blake's conversation with Colonel Morales marked the beginning of a transformation that went far deeper than anything he had experienced during his formal military education. He approached each day with a humility that was foreign to his previous experience, replacing his arrogant assumptions with genuine curiosity about what he could learn from the extraordinary woman who had chosen to invest her time in his development. "Your first lesson," Colonel Morales told him during their morning briefing, "is understanding that leadership isn't about proving you're right. It's about making sure you're serving something bigger than yourself." Blake nodded, taking notes. With the same intensity he had once reserved for academic subjects that would boost his GPA, but this was different. This wasn't about earning grades or impressing instructors. This was about becoming the kind of person who could earn the respect of someone whose courage and sacrifice had saved lives he would never know about. The change in Blake's demeanor was immediately apparent to everyone in Alpha Company. Gone was the condescending attitude toward his fellow recruits, replaced by a genuine interest in their development and success. He began seeking out opportunities to help struggling soldiers, offering assistance with the same patience that Colonel Morales had shown him despite his weeks of arrogance. "What happened to you?" Private Cross asked during one of their evening discussions. "You're like a completely different person." Blake considered the question seriously. "I learned that I've been measuring success by the wrong standards. I thought leadership was about being better than other people. Now I understand it's about making other people better." The transformation was most evident in Blake's interactions with Colonel Morales herself. Where he had once challenged her guidance and questioned her methods, he now approached each training session with the eagerness of someone who understood he was receiving instruction from one of the most accomplished soldiers in military history. During tactical exercises, Blake found himself seeing details he had missed before. Colonel Morales didn't just teach procedures. She helped him understand the thinking behind tactical decisions, the way that small choices could cascade into major consequences, and the importance of considering factors that went beyond immediate objectives. Why do you think this particular approach would be most effective? She asked during a complex scenario that involved coordinating multiple elements while avoiding detection. Blake studied the situation carefully before responding, because it accounts for the enemy's most likely response patterns and maintains flexibility for adaptation if conditions change. Good. And what are you considering beyond the immediate tactical situation? The safety of my team, the broader mission objectives, and the potential consequences of failure for people who aren't directly involved in the operation. Colonel Morales nodded approvingly. You're learning to think like a leader rather than just a tactician. The difference was profound. Blake's previous approach to military training had been mechanistic, learning procedures and techniques that would help him succeed in controlled environments. Now he was developing the kind of strategic thinking that could save lives in situations where there were no predetermined solutions. But the most significant aspect of Blake's transformation was his growing understanding of what military service actually meant. Through Colonel Morales's patient guidance, he began to see beyond the career advancement and personal recognition that had previously motivated him, toward a deeper appreciation for the responsibility that came with leading others. Tell me about Operation Sanctuary, he asked one evening. After they had finished reviewing the day's training exercises, Colonel Morales was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as she considered how to respond. What do you want to know? What it felt like to make decisions where people's lives depended on being right. Terrifying, she replied simply. Every choice carried the weight of knowing that mistakes would cost lives. Not just my own, but the lives of innocent people who were counting on me to bring them home safely. Blake listened as she described the psychological weight of command in life or death situations, the way that tactical decisions took on moral dimensions that no training scenario could fully simulate, and the responsibility that came with earning the trust of people who had no other options. How do you prepare for that level of responsibility? He asked. By understanding that it's not about you, she replied. It's about the people you're serving. When you stop thinking about your own success and start focusing on their welfare, the decisions become clearer. As the weeks progressed, Blake began to demonstrate the kind of leadership that Colonel Morales had been trying to develop in him from the beginning. During team exercises, he showed genuine concern for his subordinates' development, listened to their input with respect, and made decisions based on collective success rather than personal recognition. You're becoming the kind of leader people want to follow, Colonel Morales observed after a particularly successful training exercise. Not because you demand respect, but because you've earned it through your actions. Blake felt a pride that was different from anything he had experienced before. It wasn't the satisfaction of personal achievement, but the deeper fulfillment that came from knowing he was contributing to something meaningful and developing the skills that might someday allow him to serve others the way Colonel Morales had served those civilians in Afghanistan. The transformation extended beyond tactical skills to fundamental changes in how Blake approached relationships with his fellow soldiers. He began to see his role not as competing with others for recognition, but as contributing to collective success and helping create an environment where everyone could reach their potential. I used to think that making others look bad would make me look good, he told Colonel Morales during one of their mentoring sessions. Now I understand that making others better makes everyone better. That's the foundation of military leadership, she replied. Your success as a leader will be measured by the success of the people you lead, not by your individual achievements. Blake's fellow recruits began to notice the change as well. Where he had once been competitive and condescending, he now offered assistance and encouragement. His natural abilities, which had previously been sources of arrogance, became tools for helping others improve their own performance. "Blake's been really helpful with the marksmanship training," Private Parker observed to Colonel Morales. "He's got a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that make sense. He's learning that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than putting them down." Colonel Morales replied, "The most profound moment of Blake's transformation came during a night training exercise when one of his team members, Private Rodriguez, became separated from the group during a complex infiltration scenario. Blake's first instinct was to continue with the mission. The old Blake would have rationalized that one person's mistake shouldn't compromise the entire operation, but instead, he made the decision to abort the primary objective and focus on ensuring Rodriguez's safety. It was a choice that would have cost them points in the training evaluation, but it demonstrated the kind of leadership that prioritized people over procedures. "You made the right choice," Colonel Morales told him. During the after-action review, "A leader who will abandon team members for mission success isn't a leader worth following." Blake nodded, understanding that the lesson went far beyond training exercises. No mission is worth sacrificing the people who trust you to bring them home. As his training period at Fort Clearwater neared its end, Blake found himself approaching his upcoming assignment with a completely different perspective than he had possessed when he first arrived. He was no longer focused on rapid promotion and personal recognition. Instead, he was eager to apply the lessons he had learned about genuine leadership and service to others. "I'm going to miss this," he told Colonel Morales during one of their final training sessions. "Not just the instruction, but the opportunity to learn from someone who embodies everything I want to become as a military leader." "The learning doesn't stop when you leave here," she replied. "Every assignment is an opportunity to grow. Every challenge is a chance to apply what you've learned, and every person you serve with is a potential teacher." Blake had begun his time at Fort Clearwater as an arrogant recruit who thought he knew everything about military service. He was leaving as someone who understood that his real education was just beginning, and that the most important lessons about leadership, service, and character could only be learned through the humbling experience of discovering how much he still had to learn. The transformation was complete, but Blake knew that becoming the kind of leader who could earn the respect of someone like Colonel Morales would be the work of a lifetime. The difference was that now he understood what that work looked like, and why it mattered more than any individual achievement or recognition he might receive along the way. The final week of Blake's training at Fort Clearwater brought with it a series of conversations that would shape his understanding of military service for the rest of his career. Colonel Morales had requested private time with each of the recruits who would be graduating from the program, but Blake's sessions were longer and more intensive than the others, a recognition of how far he had traveled from the arrogant young man who had arrived months earlier. "Before you leave," Colonel Morales said as they sat in her office reviewing his final evaluation, "I want to make sure you understand not just what you've learned, but why it matters." Blake nodded, his notebook ready. These conversations had become precious to him, opportunities to gain insights from someone whose experience and wisdom went far beyond anything he had encountered in his formal military education. "When I first met you," she continued, "I saw someone with significant potential who was limited by his own assumptions about what military service meant. You thought leadership was about being better than other people. Now I hope you understand that it's about making other people better." "I do understand that," Blake replied, "but I'm still trying to figure out how to apply it consistently, especially when I'm working with people who might not want to learn or grow." Colonel Morales smiled, one of the rare expressions of genuine warmth that Blake had learned to treasure. That's exactly the right question to be asking. Leadership isn't just about inspiring people who are already motivated. It's about finding ways to reach people who don't think they need to change. She gestured toward the window that overlooked the training areas where new recruits were conducting their morning exercises. Every one of those soldiers reminds me of someone I've served with. Some will become extraordinary leaders, others will struggle with basic responsibilities, and most will fall somewhere in between. Your job as a leader is to help each of them reach their potential, regardless of where they start. Blake followed her gaze, watching the recruits work through tactical exercises with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm. How do you maintain patience with people who resist guidance the way I did? By remembering that resistance usually comes from fear or insecurity, not from genuine defiance. When someone challenges your authority or dismisses your experience, they're often protecting themselves from the discomfort of learning that they don't know as much as they thought they did. The insight hit Blake with the force of personal recognition. His own arrogance had been a defense mechanism, a way of protecting his self-image from the threatening possibility that he might be wrong about fundamental assumptions. Colonel Morales had seen through that defense and found ways to challenge him without destroying his confidence. "You never gave up on me," he said, "even when I was being completely impossible. Because I could see your potential, even when you couldn't." That's what leaders do. They see possibilities that others miss and create environments where those possibilities can be realized. Over the following days, their conversations ranged across topics that went far beyond basic military training. Colonel Morales shared insights about decision-making under pressure, the moral dimensions of leadership, and the responsibility that came with earning the trust of people whose lives depended on your judgment. "The hardest part of command," she told him during one of their evening discussions, "isn't making tactical decisions or managing resources. It's living with the consequences of choices that affect other people's lives." Blake asked about Operation Sanctuary, and Colonel Morales shared details that weren't in any official records. The weight of responsibility she had felt when she realized that 47 lives depended on her tactical decisions, the way that fear and determination had battled within her during those 3 days of combat, and the long process of recovery that had followed. "I've never told anyone this," she said, "but there were moments during that operation when I wasn't sure I was strong enough to do what needed to be done. The thing that kept me going wasn't courage. It was the knowledge that giving up wasn't an option when other people were counting on me." "How do you prepare for that level of responsibility?" Blake asked. "By understanding that it's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being committed to doing whatever it takes to serve the people who trust you. When you stop thinking about your own success and start focusing on their welfare, you find strength you didn't know you had." The lessons went beyond tactical knowledge to fundamental questions about what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. Colonel Morales helped Blake understand that military service wasn't just a career or a path to personal advancement. It was a calling that required constant growth, sacrifice, and commitment to ideals that transcended individual ambition. "The Medal of Honor isn't something I earned," she explained during one of their final conversations. "It's something I received on behalf of everyone who served with me, everyone who trained me, and everyone who trusted me with their lives. Individual awards are really recognition of collective effort." Blake found himself thinking about leadership in ways he had never considered before. The competitive mindset that had driven his academic and athletic success was being replaced by a collaborative approach that focused on collective achievement rather than personal recognition. "I used to think that being a leader meant being the best at everything," he told Colonel Morales. "Now I understand that it means creating conditions where everyone can be their best." "That's the foundation of military leadership," she replied. "Your success as a leader will be measured by the success of the people you lead, not by your individual achievements." As his departure date approached, Blake found himself reflecting on the transformation he had undergone. He had arrived at Fort Clearwater as someone who thought he understood military service based on academic study and personal ambition. He was leaving as someone who understood that his real education was just beginning. "What's the most important thing you want me to remember?" He asked Colonel Morales during their final mentoring session. She considered the question carefully before responding. That leadership is a privilege, not a right. Every person who follows you is making a choice to trust you with something precious. Their safety, their development, their belief that you care more about their welfare than your own advancement. Honor that trust by never stopping your own growth, and never forgetting that your role is to serve them, not the other way around. Blake spent his final evening at Fort Clearwater, walking through the training areas where he had learned so much about himself and about what military service actually meant. The arrogant young man who had arrived months earlier felt like a stranger now, someone whose priorities and understanding had been fundamentally transformed through the patient guidance of an extraordinary leader. The next morning, as he prepared to leave for his new assignment, Blake found Colonel Morales waiting for him in the company area. She handed him a small wrapped package. "Something to remember these lessons by," she said simply. Inside was a copy of a book on military leadership, but it wasn't the standard text he had expected. This was a collection of essays by leaders who had served in combat, who had faced the ultimate tests of character and judgment. On the inside cover, Colonel Morales had written, "For Blake, leadership is not about being followed, but about being worth following. Make it count." "Thank you," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. For not giving up on me, for teaching me what leadership actually means, and for showing me what it looks like to serve something bigger than yourself." "The teaching doesn't stop when you leave here," Colonel Morales replied. "Every assignment is an opportunity to grow. Every challenge is a chance to apply what you've learned, and every person you serve with is a potential teacher." As Blake departed Fort Clearwater, he carried with him more than technical skills or tactical knowledge. He carried an understanding of what it meant to lead with humility, serve with purpose, and approach every interaction as an opportunity to make others better. The lessons he had learned from Colonel Morales would guide him for the rest of his career, but more importantly, they would help him become the kind of leader who could earn the respect of people like her through actions rather than words. The transformation that had begun with devastating humiliation had become a foundation for a lifetime of service. Blake now understood that some of the most important lessons could only be learned through the humbling experience of discovering just how much he still had to learn, and that the greatest leaders were those who never stopped growing, never stopped serving, and never forgot that their role was to make others better than they ever thought possible. 18 months after leaving Fort Clearwater, Staff Sergeant Connor Blake stood before a formation of new recruits at Fort Benning, watching their eager faces and recognizing something familiar in their expressions. The mixture of confidence, ambition, and barely concealed arrogance reminded him of someone he had once been, someone who had thought he understood military service based on academic achievement and personal potential. "Good morning, soldiers," Blake addressed the formation, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from experience rather than rank. "I'm Staff Sergeant Blake, and I'll be one of your instructors during your time here. Before we begin, I want to tell you about the most important lesson I learned during my own training." Among the recruits, Blake noticed one young man in particular, Private Daniel Martinez, who stood in the front row, with the kind of perfect posture and confident bearing that suggested he expected to be noticed and appreciated. His uniform was immaculate, his boots gleamed, and his expression carried the subtle superiority that Blake remembered all too well from his own early days of military service. "Leadership," Blake continued, "isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having the most impressive credentials. It's about serving something bigger than yourself and making the people around you better than they thought they could be." Over the following weeks, Blake watched Martinez exhibit the same patterns of behavior that had marked his own arrival at Fort Clearwater. The young recruit was talented, confident, and completely convinced of his own superiority. He questioned instructions from NCOs he considered beneath his potential, made condescending comments about fellow recruits who struggled with basic tasks, and approached every training exercise as an opportunity to demonstrate his individual excellence. "Sergeant Blake," Martinez said after a particularly challenging tactical exercise, "I think there might be more efficient approaches to some of these scenarios. At West Point, we studied more advanced tactical concepts that could improve our performance." Blake felt a familiar flash of recognition. The tone, the implicit criticism, the assumption that his experience was limited, all of it echoed his own interactions with Colonel Morales months earlier. But instead of responding with irritation or defensiveness, Blake saw an opportunity to apply the lessons he had learned about patient leadership and mentorship. "Tell me about these advanced concepts," Blake replied, genuinely interested in Martinez's perspective while also recognizing the teachable moment that was developing. Martinez launched into a detailed explanation of tactical theories he had studied, complete with references to historical examples and academic sources. His knowledge was impressive, but Blake could see the gaps between theoretical understanding and practical application that would need to be addressed. "Those are solid concepts," Blake acknowledged when Martinez finished. "How do you think they would apply in situations where you don't have complete information or where conditions change rapidly?" The question caught Martinez off guard, just as Colonel Morales's questions had challenged Blake's assumptions months earlier. Blake watched the young recruit struggle with scenarios that went beyond textbook solutions, and he recognized the same learning opportunity that had been created for him. "I think we should test some of these approaches during tomorrow's exercise," Blake suggested. "You can lead a squad and implement the tactical concepts you've described. Let's see how they work in practice." The exercise that followed was carefully designed to challenge Martinez's assumptions while providing opportunities for growth rather than simple failure. Blake had learned from Colonel Morales that the most effective teaching happened when students discovered their own limitations through experience rather than lecture. As the exercise progressed, Martinez encountered the same challenges that had humbled Blake during his own training. His theoretical knowledge was solid, but he struggled to adapt when conditions changed, had difficulty incorporating input from subordinates, and became increasingly frustrated when reality didn't conform to his academic models. "How do you think that went?" Blake asked during the after-action review, using the same patient questioning approach that Colonel Morales had employed with him. Martinez's response was defensive, focused on external factors that had prevented him from implementing his tactical concepts effectively. Blake recognized the same rationalization process he had used to protect his own ego when confronted with evidence of his limitations. "Let me tell you about my first training experience," Blake said, settling in for a longer conversation. "I arrived at my assignment convinced that I knew everything about military service based on my academic background and personal potential. I spent weeks dismissing the guidance of an instructor I considered beneath my abilities." Martinez listened with growing interest as Blake described his own journey from arrogance to humility, though he carefully avoided revealing Colonel Morales's identity or specific details about her background. The focus was on the lessons learned rather than the dramatic circumstances that had forced his transformation. "What changed your mind?" Martinez asked. "I discovered that the instructor I had been dismissing was one of the most accomplished soldiers I would ever meet. Someone whose experience and wisdom went far beyond what I could have imagined. I learned that my assumptions about military service were completely wrong, and that real leadership had nothing to do with proving I was better than other people." Over the following months, Blake worked patiently with Martinez, using the same approach that Colonel Morales had used with him. He challenged assumptions through questions rather than criticism, created opportunities for growth through experience rather than lecture, and demonstrated that effective leadership was about serving others rather than advancing oneself. The transformation was gradual but profound. Martinez began to show the same humility and commitment to collective success that Blake had learned to value. He started helping struggling recruits instead of competing with them, sought guidance rather than defending his assumptions, and approached each training exercise as an opportunity to learn rather than to prove his superiority. "You're becoming the kind of leader people want to follow," Blake told Martinez during one of their mentoring sessions. "Not because you demand respect, but because you've earned it through your actions." Blake's influence extended beyond individual recruits to the entire training program. He had introduced methods and approaches that he had learned from Colonel Morales, emphasizing character development alongside tactical skills and creating environments where soldiers could learn from mistakes rather than being punished for them. "Your training methods are getting attention," Master Sergeant Patricia Wilson observed during a monthly evaluation meeting. "Recruit satisfaction scores are up, performance metrics are improving, and we're seeing fewer disciplinary issues." "What's your secret?" "I learned from the best," Blake replied simply. "Someone who taught me that leadership is about making others better, not about proving how good you are yourself." The legacy of Colonel Morales' teaching continued to expand through Blake's influence on the soldiers he trained. Each recruit who learned to approach military service with humility and commitment to others would carry those lessons to their own future assignments, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond any individual training program. One evening, as Blake reviewed training reports in his office, he received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was immediately familiar. "Hello, Blake. This is Colonel Morales. I heard about the excellent work you're doing at Fort Benning." Blake felt the same rush of respect and gratitude that he had experienced during his training at Fort Clearwater. "Colonel, it's good to hear from you. I'm just trying to apply the lessons you taught me, and doing it well, from what I understand. I wanted you to know that the approach you're taking is exactly what I hoped you would learn. You're making a real difference in the lives of the soldiers you're training." They talked for nearly an hour, with Colonel Morales sharing insights about leadership development and Blake describing the challenges and successes he had experienced in his role as an instructor. The conversation reinforced his understanding that the learning process never ended, and that the best leaders were those who continued to grow throughout their careers. "I have one more piece of advice," Colonel Morales said as their conversation concluded. "Remember that the most important lessons you'll teach won't be about tactics or procedures. They'll be about character, integrity, and the importance of serving something bigger than yourself. Those are the lessons that will stay with your students long after they've forgotten the technical details." As Blake ended the call, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from arrogant recruit to respected instructor. The transformation had begun with the humbling discovery that he had been wrong about fundamental assumptions regarding military service and leadership. It had continued through patient mentorship from someone whose experience and wisdom had earned through extraordinary service and sacrifice. Now, as he worked with new generations of soldiers, Blake carried forward the legacy of that mentorship. He understood that his role wasn't just to teach tactical skills or military procedures, but to help young people discover what it meant to serve others with humility, courage, and unwavering commitment to ideals that transcended personal ambition. The lessons he had learned from Colonel Morales would continue to influence military service long after his own career ended, carried forward by the soldiers he trained, who would in turn teach others about the true meaning of leadership and service. It was exactly the kind of legacy that someone like Colonel Morales would want, not a monument to individual achievement, but a network of people committed to making others better than they ever thought possible. In the end, Blake had learned that the most extraordinary people were often hiding in plain sight, distinguished not by their need for recognition, but by their commitment to serving others regardless of whether anyone noticed. And the most important lessons about leadership, character, and service could only be learned through the humbling experience of discovering just how much there was still to learn from people who had earned the right to teach through their actions, rather than their words. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.